Welcome to the Fatigue Files, a podcast that explores fatigue conditions from as many angles as possible while pushing the boundaries of thinking about fatigue as a signal to the 21st century and beyond. Cutting-edge thinking, practical strategies, thought-provoking explorations. They're going to all be here, and I'm your host, Anna Greer, welcoming you to this edition of the Fatigue Files. So everybody, welcome to another edition of the Fatigue Files podcast. And I'm delighted to have with me today a very dear friend of mine, Andreas Philippopoulos-Mihalopoulos, who is an artist, a fiction writer, and an academic with an extraordinary imagination and great depth of understanding. And we're here today to think about thinking with water. That might sound strange, but we're going to try and unpack it. Andreas, what would you like to start with?
Thinking with water is a really interesting concept, isn't it? Because, of course, we don't associate thinking with water. Thinking is something that we think we do within the confines of our brain, our head, and all of a sudden to try and understand thinking as an expanded ability or skill or even simple occurrence, and actually naturalize this idea that thinking doesn't take place only in an individual brain, but in and I'll use that both metaphorically and actually in this kind of oceanic way, a communal way of thinking. It's not exactly new, but it challenges certainly some ideas about what we mean by thinking.
It does, doesn't it? It really does. And I know, Andreas, that you've got experiences of fatigue, and we were sort of kicking around the idea of exploring the relationship between fatigue and fluidity, and just how thinking with water and thinking of ourselves as more fluid might be a resource when faced against issues such as fatigue and bodily limitations.
I think there's an interesting concept about water as liquid, and of course we also have to keep in mind that water is both aerial, it's steam, is vapor. It's also solid, it's ice. It falls, or it stands, or it kind of becomes volumes, and it turns and swirls. And in that sense, it's fluid. So there's a fluidity of form. There's a fluidity of constant transformation. And fatigue, my experiences with fatigue is that there was this almost demand to stop transforming, to become one thing, to remain. And that is probably why I'm terrified of it. I think it has to do with this fear of dying, essentially. It's this not even that deeper fear of stopping and sleeping and therefore dying. And sadly, and I know that I'm not the only one who puts sleep and death together, and that's probably why most of us have some sleep disturbance of one type or the other. There's always this need to keep on transforming ourselves and becoming other and becoming. So there is this need to carry on living, which means to become constantly in other form, to remain fluid in the way that we transform ourselves, and we become. We take on different guises and different consistencies, and we end up in different places and playing different roles. And then there is this other water that I'm very keen on. It's a water that is inaccessible, apparently in the core of the earth, something that is as inaccessible as the depths of our brain or the outer space. There is water captured in carbon. In exactly the same way as there is water in interplanetary positions. So floating about, but never destined, of course, to become rain or anything like that. This kind of water, to me, carries a particular significance. It's a space of presence, yes, yet inaccessibility. And in those moments, I can imagine how the practice of thinking with water becomes more, in some ways, more tangible, because it becomes cosmic. We think along other bodies of water. There's a large literature. We can various names for it, but one generic name might be hydro studies or hydrofeminism, because indeed it deals a lot with feminism, or it starts with feminism and queer studies, and then it moves into questions of water. Astrid Manis, for example, is one of the people who works with it, who's an academic as well as an artist. And this literature talks about how we are all bodies of water, connected with each other, but also, and I think, certainly from my perspective, I would emphasize that, also withdrawn, also different from the other. So if we can think about how our existence is both at the same time a continuum with all the other bodies of water, as well as a rupture from other bodies. So we need to become ourselves. We need to have our own identity, our own self, our own visiting cards, our own names. Yet we are all part of this bigger oceanic surface. And this can be echoed a little bit in this kind of exoplanetary water, as well as in the deep earth core water, because it points to things that we simply cannot understand right now. We might, but we might not. And we might, expire before we understand, or before we really encounter that water in the core of the earth. And you think that, how come? I mean, it's just here. How come it's impossible to get to it? Well, that's exactly the point. So I like the idea that the water is both present and thoroughly withdrawn, thoroughly absent from our lives. Now, this might sound a little abstract, but the reason for which I want to think about it is because that's almost a kind of way of thinking about fatigue, something that compels us into staying put, but also exploring stuff that are at least on a phenomenal level, and the level of the visible, the tangible, etc., inaccessible.
I think there's a wonderful metaphor there as well. The withdrawn but present nature of the body of water that you're talking about, the bodies of water you're talking about, strike me as incredibly resonant with themes around the unconscious and the conscious-unconscious dynamics of when one is forced to stop, forced to rest, and what emerges in that process out of the psyche can be extraordinarily deep and extraordinarily confusing. And the unconscious is present and sometimes accessible, but there is an immense amount there that is intrinsically withdrawn, that lies in shadow. And perhaps we never get to the end of the shadow. There's always something permanently withdrawn there. But to me, the art then of relating to that is in itself a kind of fluidity. It's a kind of capacity to let go and, yes, to become aerial in the sense of a kind of dissipation of control, a real relinquishment of that attempt. Yes, to become fluid in the sense of strategically flexible, adaptable. And yes, in a sense, to be solid or present, just thinking about your ice analogy, in the sense of grounded, knowing that you're there. And the groundedness itself becomes, in that context, a deep mode of healing, as does the dissipation, as does the fluidity. So I think there's an incredible analogy here, Andreas.
Well, and you put it incredibly well. I have to say that's absolutely beautiful, and I think it's probably useful as well in the sense that it's practically useful. I remember, so my experience of fatigue are not chronic, and they are isolated episodes that they've been called almost like a signaling of what might happen, and and I know that my fatigue has to do. There were 2 episodes where I lost contact with causality. So I lost contact with where things were coming from, why they were there, and what is the connection to me, the deeper connection to me. So I couldn't recognize text messages that I have sent. I couldn't recognize a face cream I had, and I was thinking, why do I have that here? There was this, and of course came with intense frustration and fatigue. And I remember thinking that this erasure almost of the non-relevant was a revelation. The first time that happened, despite the fact that I was incredibly worried about it, I was also somehow, and there's no other way of saying it, swimming in this lightness. I was almost thinking, well, it's fine if I don't function fully. And when I say fully, I mean function on 4 different platforms in 4 different disciplines with 10 different people and 4 different languages at any one time. So if I don't function fully, that's okay. And I understand that this was a light version of what other people experience as fatigue, and I have full respect for that. I just wonder, though, whether, and of course, listening to the podcasts and to the previous work you've done on fatigue, I realized that there are quite a few people who have found positive things in fatigue. Now, I am naturally somebody who looks for the silver lining. It doesn't even look; it just appears to me. And somehow the silver lining was this: there was almost I almost abandoned the sense of self that I have, or I think I have at that point, and I was reaching, as you say, into something. And there was a lot of unconscious in there, a lot of things that I was almost back touching rather than front touching. I wasn't holding it. I was fumbling backwards to see what this thing was, maybe recoiling even in fear. There were a lot of emotions going on, and in fact, it's really not something that I want to experience again. However, it is incredibly instructive.
It really is. It really is. And I am definitely one of the people that has learnt the positive dimensions of it, which is not to say that I haven't suffered. Of course I have. I've suffered very deeply, as many, many, many people with, long-term chronic fatigue conditions do. But I think it was Ashok Gupta who described it as a transformer. He said it's not even just a teacher, it's a transformer. And that, again, you see, I think water is also, in some very rich sense, an ultimate transformer. It's incredibly mutable, and it shows up. There's even a 4th phase of water, which is a gel-like phase that, I think it's called EZ water around the cells. I mean, it's an extraordinary element. And so thinking with it, both in terms of practical ways in which water becomes a mode of healing, there's also a sense in which thinking with water becomes a mode of self-encounter, which I love the fact that you linked it to the oceanic, because one of the transformative things that I found in fatigue is it's a great spiritual teacher, and it really opens you to the oceanic dimensions of the self that lies beyond the ego structure. It really does. It really comes permeated with portals and possibilities for experiencing that. And I don't know if you were experiencing any of that. I mean, sometimes that is a place of terror, let's be honest. There are moments when experiencing that sense of non-self, the radical expansion to the little self, is absolutely terrifying and can become a spasm of fear. I'm just wondering, you were talking about fumbling backwards into unconsciousness. How much of that do you think, as well, Andreas, was contacting more oceanic possibilities that were head spinning?
I think, just like for many people, for me too, water isn't only a beautiful thing; it's also a thing of terror. I'm fascinated both by its its immensity, its fluidity, its transformative effect. And this fascination is also utter fear. It's also the fear of intense dissolution of the self. The classic image of one drop in the ocean. It's where you let go of your individuality. I was born in Greece and brought up in Greece. And in Greece, there is no ocean. And that's an interesting difference, because quite a lot of these studies are Anglo-Saxon studies, and the ocean is big in that imagination. In Greece, and perhaps I would say more European, Central European experience, is a different kind of water. It's a much more contained water, the Mediterranean, the rivers, the lakes, etc. And this is more my water, in the sense that I still have the fear, but I know that the fear ends somewhere. There is a coast somewhere, not far out. I would call it almost the archipelagic. So the archipelagos is the constellation of islands scattered along a body of water. I like the possibility of links and nodes. And easy movement between one and the other, the possibility of always holding a little bit onto land while you let go into the water. There's also this false sense of security that this archipelagic gives to people. So people who try to cross from Africa to Italy, a short distance, surely we can manage. There is this illusion, or perhaps illusionary promise, of arrival in the archipelagic, which is not in the oceanic. And the oceanic is about completely getting lost and opening up and allow yourself to be opened up by the ocean. So I think that my water is a little more tamed, and this is the way that it appears in my fiction as well. I've written a book, a fiction of short stories called The Book of Water, and there my publicist, who's also the editor, said, "Well, your water is a modernist water, is a water enclosed in containers, and it's limited. It's not the open water of the Romantics." And that was that was really enlightening for me, because I hadn't realized that this was how it was. In that, this water is a little more manageable for me, and I think I would like to imagine my whether fatigue or indeed this possibility of dropping one's intense connection to one's individuality and self as a short swim to the next island. It's still deep. There can still be very, horrible waves, but there is also a good chance that you will arrive somewhere, and then you can carry on moving to the next island. And this also goes together with this thinking I'm trying to cultivate of the plurality, not just of the bodies, but of the connection between bodies. Something I've been working on is this concept of hydrojustice, ways in which we need to conceptualize justice, not simply as something between humans, certainly not anymore, but something that involves the elements. And the elemental, in this case, the water, is something that determines not just how justice is thought, but also how justice is administered. And it talks about confluence, but it also talks about just emplacement within this constant fluid reality. So there's a commoning in water, which I think is incredibly important. And of course, there's for humans, there is always this sense of regression, of going back, of returning to the water, positive regression, which I think we still remember in our bodies. There's also, we don't have to think of prehistory. We can only think of going back to the amniotic. We return to the womb. That intense maternal moment is a moment where you become both intensely yourself and also you lose yourself because you are part of another body. that is an extraordinary lesson. And that can only be learned through the water. And again, and I perhaps I'm romanticizing, but it did feel like a return to some sort of womb-like situation when I lost contact with causality.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I love this framing that you just brought of hydrojustice, because justice isn't something that we often think about in contact with fatigue as a bodily matter. We might think about socioeconomic toxic structures and the way they generate uneven levels of fatigue, the way that some populations are more fatigued than others because of structural conditions. We might think of justice and injustice in that context, and I think it's an important thing to do. But there's also something here with the concept of hydrojustice moving beyond the human. I was really struck by the idea that fatigue also teaches us to do justice to the more than human ocean inside us. I mean, we're, 10% human, 90%, viral, microbial and cellular and all the rest of it. And so there is a sense here when you get a fatigue condition, you start learning about the foundations of human well-being, where you have to confront the fact that actually you've been living out of deep attunement with these whole populations of highly intelligent entities and systems and relationships that make up the assemblage we think of as the human body. This notion of hydrojustice I find quite inspiring brought next to that, because it implies that actually there's a call here to do more than recover, that in the effort to recovery, there's a call to a kind of hydrojustice of the self, where you start putting into right relationship what you've inadvertently got into wrong relationship because of toxic structures or exposure to environmental toxins or poor life choices where you simply didn't realize what you were doing to your own body, or even in some situations you might realize and you might have not had the wherewithal to really attend to that. But I think that's a beautiful framing, Andreas, this question of hydrojustice, to bring into this question of the relationship with the self in fatigue, as is the oceanic, because actually the swells and waves of all that movement in the system, the way that there are symphonies. I mean, you were talking about sleep being like death. It's very interesting that both sleep and death are active states. It's very easy to think of them as stasis, whereas in fact, in sleep, there's this cascade of activity going on in the body over the 24-hour circadian clock. And even in death, there's processes going on which are lively processes, even though the person or the body isn't alive in the sense that it was. So I think there's some really provocative themes here, that when you have fatigue and you really start thinking into the complexity of the body, encountering that question of justice, I think is a really profound direction to reflect in.
I think so too. I think hydrojustice calls for two things, two slightly paradoxical, certainly between them antithetical things, both flows and barriers, sluice gates and free flowing, and both need to coexist in the definition of the hydro self. In some sort of balance, but sometimes in a little bit of a conflict as well. And that's absolutely fine, I think. There's this aquatic continuum that unites all the bodies, this confluence of bodies. And on the other hand, these barriers that have to stop the flow and that will allow the emergence of individuality. This is the just distribution of bodies in space. So I cannot be in the same space as you are at exactly the same time. I need the barrier. Even in this intense fluidity of the continuum where we are all one, I also need to be a different one. And this is slightly schizophrenic, but it's a very productive schizophrenic moment. And we all know that we both need to be constantly connected, but also withdrawn. And that, I think, is the way out, as well as the way deeper into a state of creative fatigue of post-fatigue. And I'm struggling with both. I'm struggling to be correctly continuous with the other bodies. And what does that mean? Justly continuous, without imposing, encroaching upon, bleeding into another body. But at the same time, constantly connected with them, but connected in a way that I don't allow them to flood me either. And on a psychological level, I think this is the key to a healthy life, in a sense. A healthy mind and a healthy life and a healthy brain is to know where to flow and where to stop. But also in a more cosmic, planetary, ecological, social justice level, I think this is exactly the question of where do you stop and where do I start? And how can we live together without constantly pushing that barrier between us in order to get one more single inch of space?
Absolutely. And to think as well about the membrane between the human and non-human in that context as well. I mean, we're using it in a way interpersonally at the moment. In a sense, we're talking about boundaries, connectedness and withdrawal, as you say, fundamental to well-being. We absolutely need connection. We absolutely need withdrawal. And they dance in a paradoxical relationship. And it's never static. It's always being renegotiated, either within the self or between selves. But I love the idea as well of bringing in, again, the more than human, since we are also more than human ourselves, but also thinking about the relational spatial justice and hydrojustice between us and other species, I think is critical as well. And it goes to the roots of the whole fatigue question, because so much fatigue is generated by structural, social, settled ways of not doing that, of violating that. And there has to be, I think, and there is increasingly a kind of eco-sensitive rediscovery of new forms of relationship and respect. But to actually think consciously with that, to understand fatigue as a call into those kinds of relational sensitivities, those modes of connectedness and withdrawal which generate health, not just for us, but for the non-humans of which we are made up and also entangled with, is surely the only intelligent way forward at this point of the 21st century.
I would think so. And I also think that it's no longer a choice. It is the thing we are confronted with. It seems to me that it really is the only way, because we know that, and I don't even know whether it can still work. I don't subscribe necessarily to the absolute doom, but we know that we are going down a path which is incredibly destructive, self-destructive and other destructive. And in that sense, we no longer have choices. This is the only way we can think of ourselves in relation to others.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the only choice is towards destruction or away from it, in the sense that we can't really choose completely in respect of consequences anymore. Some consequences are already locked in. If you think about climate change, for example, some of those climate catastrophe loops are already, the feedback loops are already locked in, and we don't yet know where they'll land. There is a kind of choicefulness at the political level, in the sense that, but you're right, it's a choicefulness against the non-negotiability of the parameters of what we're now facing.
I think so. I mean, if we're talking about crisis, and we've been in crisis for the past few centuries, of course, I find it a little hard to carry on this discussion anymore. I don't think we are in crisis. I think that we have to accept that crisis is irreversible. And on that basis, learning to deal even with the possibility of a future that will not include humans, not the way that we have thought so far. So we're talking about a new hydrohuman, a decentered, technologically mediated, existentially though horizontal element of the planet, and this flirting with horizontality is really important for hydrojustice. It's sort of a flat plane and non-hierarchical, and where things happen and take form, of course, within this horizon or within this horizontality, but without competing necessarily with the other, without trying to build all these towers that will inevitably collapse. It's very difficult. I don't know how to do without the hubris when it comes to the human. But again, I don't think there is a choice anymore.
I agree. And I think, again, there's another analogy here to the experience of deep, chronic, complex fatigue, because that's a very humbling moment and a very humbling experience. And one of the things it teaches you is the constrained nature of choosing within the situation in which choice is limited by certain realities. So there is always a sense of the agentic, but it's very mediated through certain what feel like non-negotiable givens that the body itself presents. And a key moment in anyone's recovery journey, in my experience, is the moment when they kind of say, okay, I accept this as my reality. I accept this, and stop pushing blindly against the signals, which again has such metaphorical resonance for the way that human communities are acting in the face of the climate crisis. I mean, there are some sociopathic impulses that are still driving, still pushing, still pressing despite the symptoms. There are others who are going, hang on a minute, we need to listen to the symptoms. The collective body, including the planetary body, is sick. We have to respond if we're going to find a new form of homeostasis. I think people with fatigue are living those individuated expressions of something that's much, much more collective.
To go back to the question of choice, and maybe to lighten up a little bit, the Book of Water I wrote on a tiny Greek island with about 40 permanent residents. And I was writing one story every day, and it was essentially an observation either of an image or people that we got to know on the island, and then thinking about that and then writing something which is kind of visual, philosophical. And then in the evening we would go back and maybe sometimes read the story to the people about whom the story was written. And it was such a beautiful moment to connect the text, the aquatic that always surrounded us being on an island, and the person about whom was centered. But the reason for which I've always chosen that island is because it only has one taverna. And I said, the moment that it acquires a second taverna, and therefore I will have a choice to go to one or other taverna, I will stop going to this island, because that will be the end of freedom.
Nicely paradoxical, Andreas. So have you got any closing thoughts on fatigue and fluidity, fatigue and water for listeners?
I think when I walk into water, whether it's the bath water, which is always obviously hotter than one's skin, or the sea water or a lake water that is cooler than one's skin, there's always this moment of not belonging, but also of an invitation, and an invitation to become homeostatically, either cold or hot. I want to believe that I will be able to deal with my future moments of fatigue as if entering a pool of water, not an unfriendly water, not a threatening water, but a water that will allow me to leave myself and my beloved 36.6 degrees of Celsius temperature away behind me, and embrace a slightly different temperature and become one with something that is bigger than me.
Yeah, that's stunning. That's a really good thought to end on. So yeah, absolutely. And the invitation is very powerful from fatigue to make that shift, to make a shift into different layers of homeostasis that take a different form from what was there before. Thank you very much, Andreas, for a stimulating, fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Anna, for confluencing with me.
Yeah, nice one.